Montana Territory, 1878. The town of Silver Creek rested uneasily between civilization and wilderness, where the smell of pine sap mingled with wood smoke and cattle dust. It was a place where men staked their claims with fence posts and defended them with Winchester rifles. In this harsh land, Vincent Jameson had learned one truth above all others: the frontier was no place for tenderness. Survival demanded strength, not sentiment, especially for a cowboy who had witnessed how quickly the West could strip a man of everything he loved. At 25, Vincent had already weathered more hardships than most men twice his age. Tall and broad-shouldered from years of breaking horses and mending fences, he moved with the easy confidence of someone who understood his place in the world. His features were handsome in a rugged way: strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer storm. He kept his light brown hair trimmed neat, though it curled slightly at the nape of his neck beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The faint stubble on his jaw was the only concession to the days spent far from civilization. Today, as he guided his chestnut mare down Silver Creek's main street, Vincent's thoughts were occupied with practical concerns: supplies, cattle prices, and the coming winter. Romance was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after watching his father waste away from grief when his mother died of fever 5 years ago. Love made a man vulnerable in ways no gunslinger ever could. That was Vincent's creed, his protection against a world that took more than it gave. "Jameson," Sheriff Dawson called from the boardwalk, "you planning to stay in town a spell? We could use an extra hand with the Harvest Festival preparations." Vincent tipped his hat. "Just here for supplies, Sheriff. Got a herd to move before the cold sets in." "Shame. Your father was always good about community matters." Vincent nodded, allowing the sting of the comparison to reinforce his resolve. Community ties were just another form of vulnerability. He dismounted outside Willard's general store, securing his mare to the hitching post before stepping inside. The familiar scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco greeted him, along with Mrs. Willard's cheerful voice. "Vincent Jameson, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in nearly a month." "Been busy at the ranch, ma'am." He placed his supply list on the counter, eager to conclude his business efficiently. Mrs. Willard clucked her tongue. All work and no company makes for a lonely winter, young man. Vincent managed a polite smile without responding. He'd heard these well-meaning comments before, from townspeople who couldn't understand that loneliness was preferable to loss. He was scanning the shelves when a commotion from the back room disrupted his thoughts. "I don't care what your policy is, Mr. Willard. When I pay for goods, I expect fair treatment." A woman's voice, clear and defiant, rang through the store. Vincent turned just as she stormed from the back room, Mr. Willard following with a flustered expression. The woman was striking, no more than 20 years old, with honey-blonde hair gathered in a practical braid that hung to the middle of her back. Her dress was a simple blue calico, more practical than fashionable, though it couldn't hide her slender figure. But it was the fire in her hazel eyes that caught Vincent's attention, a determination that seemed almost out of place in a town where most women deferred to male authority without question. "Miss Reeves, please lower your voice," Mr. Willard pleaded. "I've explained that I can't extend more credit." "And I've explained that I'm not asking for credit," she countered, pulling a leather pouch from her pocket and emptying several coins onto the counter. "This is payment for the medicine my grandmother needs, the same medicine you charged the Hendersons $2 less for last week." "Message." Willard intervened, shooting her husband a stern look. "George, did you raise the price on Miss Reeves?" "Business is business, Martha. Supply and demand." "Supply and prejudice, more like," the young woman interrupted. "Everyone knows you charge more for folks living at the old Reynolds place, as if being away from town makes us deserving of your inflated prices." Vincent found himself watching the exchange with unexpected interest. Most of Silver Creek's residents had long accepted the Willards' sliding scale of prices without complaint. "Now see here, Miss Reeves," Mr. Willard drew himself up. "After your grandmother married that half-breed trapper, and then your mother followed suit with that drifter, you can hardly expect basic decency," she finished, her voice dangerously quiet. "Actually, I can and do expect it, Mr. Willard, and my name is Grace Reeves, though I suspect you know that perfectly well." Vincent stepped forward before conscious thought could stop him. "Everything all right here?" 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. Grace Reeves assessed him with a quick, evaluating glance that made him feel unexpectedly exposed. "Just a disagreement over fair commerce," she replied coolly. "Mr. Willard seized the opportunity. Jameson, you understand business. Tell Miss Reeves that different customers merit different considerations." Vincent looked between them, then at the medicine bottle on the counter, laudanum for pain, likely for an elderly woman suffering through the approaching winter. The situation pulled at something he'd thought long buried, a sense of justice his father had instilled in him before grief hollowed the man out. "Actually, Mr. Willard, my father always said a man's word and fair dealing were all he truly owned in this world." Vincent reached into his pocket and placed $2 silver on the counter. "I'll take that bottle and whatever else Miss Reeves needs, at the standard price you'd charge me." Surprise flashed across Grace's face, quickly replaced by wariness. "I don't need charity, Mr. Jameson." "It's not charity to insist on fair dealing," Vincent replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "And it's Vincent." For a moment nobody moved, then Grace nodded once sharply. "Very well, I also need flour, coffee, and salt." She turned to Mr. Willard, "at the standard price." The storekeeper's face reddened, but with Vincent watching, he gathered the items without further argument. Vincent added them to his own order, settling the account with efficiency that discouraged further discussion. Outside the store, Grace turned to him, squinting slightly in the bright afternoon sun. "That was unexpected, Mr. Jameson." "Vincent," he corrected again, loading supplies onto his horse. "Vincent, then." She studied him with those direct hazel eyes. "Why interfere? Most folks in town are content to look the other way when it comes to the Reeves women." The question caught him off guard. Why had he interfered? It went against his policy of minimal involvement. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he finally said. "Nothing more complicated than that." Grace's lips curved into a smile that transformed her face, softening its determined lines. "Well, regardless of your reasons, thank you. My grandmother's joints pain her terribly as the weather turns." "You live far?" Vincent found himself asking, though he knew the answer. The old Reynolds place lay 5 miles outside town, isolated and difficult to reach when winter set in. "Far enough. I've got my wagon." She gestured to a small buckboard hitched at the end of the street. Vincent glanced at the gathering clouds. "Storm's coming. Those supplies look heavy." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering assistance, Mr. Jameson?" "Vincent," he said for the third time, surprising himself with the offer forming on his lips. "And yes, I suppose I am." The moment stretched between them, laden with implications neither had intended when the day began. Vincent knew he should retract the offer. Every instinct cultivated over years of deliberate distance warned against this connection. Yet he found himself waiting for her answer with unexpected tension. Grace finally nodded. "I accept then. My grandmother would never forgive me if I refused help and ended up stranded in a storm." As they loaded her supplies into the wagon, Vincent told himself this was merely common decency, the kind any cowboy would offer a woman facing a difficult journey home. It had nothing to do with the way sunlight caught in her honey-blonde hair, or how her quiet determination reminded him of something he'd lost long ago. He couldn't have known that this simple act of kindness would be the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart, or that the approaching storm would strand him at the Reynolds place, forcing him to confront not only the fierce independence of Grace Reeves, but also the loneliness he'd convinced himself was strength. The sky darkened ominously as Vincent and Grace made their way along the winding trail to the Reynolds homestead. What should have been a straightforward journey became increasingly treacherous as the wind picked up, bringing with it the first stinging pellets of sleet. "We should pick up the pace," Vincent called over the rising howl of the wind. He rode alongside the wagon, occasionally glancing at Grace, who handled the reins with practiced ease despite the deteriorating conditions. "Almost there," she replied, her voice steady though her cheeks had reddened from the cold. "Just past that ridge." The ridge turned out to be a modest rise that gave way to reveal a small valley cradling a sturdy log cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. A weathered barn stood nearby, along with a corral and small garden plot now dormant for the coming winter. It was a modest homestead, but Vincent could see it had been maintained with care despite what must have been challenging circumstances. By the time they reached the cabin, the sleet had transformed into driving snow. Vincent helped Grace unhitch the horses and lead them into the barn, working quickly in the face of the worsening storm. "You'll have to stay until this passes." Grace said matter-of-factly as they hurried toward the cabin, arms loaded with supplies. The trail back to town will be impossible once night falls. Vincent hesitated, the thought of spending the night in close quarters with strangers, with her, triggering his instinct to retreat. But the alternative was potentially freezing to death, and even he wasn't that committed to isolation. If your grandmother doesn't mind, he conceded. Grace's laugh surprised him, a warm sound in the cold air. Grandmother Eliza rarely minds anything except injustice and poor manners. You've already shown yourself free of the latter. The cabin door opened before they reached it, revealing an elderly woman wrapped in a patchwork shawl. Despite her obvious age, she stood straight, her silver hair braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. Her eyes, the same hazel as Grace's, were sharp and assessing. "You've brought company, Gracie," she observed, stepping back to allow them entry, and just in time, that storm set to be a fierce one. "Grandmother, this is Vincent Jameson. He helped me at Willard's store and escorted me home." Grace stamped snow from her boots before entering. "Mr. Jameson, my grandmother, Eliza Reeves." "Ma'am," Vincent removed his hat as he crossed the threshold, struck by the unexpected warmth and comfort of the cabin's interior. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the single room was neat and well-appointed with handmade furniture, colorful quilts, and shelves lined with books, more books than he'd seen outside the schoolhouse. "Jameson," Eliza repeated, studying him. "Charles Jameson's boy." Vincent nodded, surprised. "You knew my father." "This territory wasn't always so populated, young man. In my day, neighbors knew each other, even those miles apart." She gestured toward the table. "Sit. You look half frozen, and Grace has brought supplies for a proper meal, I hope." As Grace unpacked the provisions, Vincent found himself drawn into conversation with Eliza. The older woman possessed a remarkable knowledge of the territory's history and didn't hesitate to share it, along with pointed observations about the changing attitudes in Silver Creek. "Used to be folks understood we needed each other out here," she said, accepting the medicine Grace offered with a nod of thanks. "Now it's all about who belongs and who doesn't. As if any of us truly belonged on this land to begin with." Vincent caught the undercurrent in her words. "I gather the Willards aren't the only ones in town who give you trouble." Grace, who had begun preparing a stew, glanced over her shoulder. "Let's just say that having a grandmother who married a Blackfoot trapper and a mother who ran off with a stranger makes one something of an outsider, even if both men have been dead for years. People find it convenient to forget that my Samuel built half the structures in Silver Creek," Eliza added, her voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Or that Grace's father taught their children to read before he caught fever and died." Vincent shifted uncomfortably, aware that he had deliberately distanced himself from town matters in recent years. How much had he missed by retreating to his ranch? How many injustices had he allowed to flourish through his indifference? "I'm sorry," he said simply. Eliza's expression softened. "You've nothing to apologize for, young man. Your father was a good man, fair and honest. I was sorry to hear how he changed after your mother passed." The mention of his father's decline brought a familiar ache. "He never recovered from losing her." "And you decided not to risk the same fate," Eliza observed with unexpected perception. Understandable, but a shame nonetheless. Before Vincent could respond to this uncomfortable insight, Grace placed bowls of fragrant stew on the table. "Enough reminiscing," she said firmly. "Eat while it's hot. The storm won't wait for us to finish our conversation." The meal was simple but delicious, and Vincent found himself relaxing despite his usual guardedness. Grace and Eliza spoke of practical matters, repairs needed before deep winter, concerns about the garden's yield, a neighbor's new baby, and gradually included him in their conversation. It struck him how long it had been since he'd shared a meal and genuine talk with anyone. The ranch hands respected his preference for solitude, and he rarely lingered in town long enough for meaningful interaction. As the evening deepened, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, and snow accumulated against the windows. Grace lit oil lamps that cast a golden glow throughout the room, then excused herself to check on the animals in the barn. "I'll go," Vincent offered, already reaching for his coat. "We'll both go," Grace countered. "I know my animals, and 4 hands are better than 2 in weather like this." Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow. They struggled through knee-deep snow to the barn, where the horses nickered nervously at the storm's violence. Working together, they secured loose boards, ensured the animals had water and feed, and reinforced the door against the wind. In the lantern light, snowflakes caught in Grace's eyelashes and hair, transforming her from merely pretty to ethereal. Vincent found himself watching her hands as she soothed a nervous mare, capable hands, neither soft nor pampered but strong and sure. "You handle horses well," he observed. "Necessity," she replied without looking up. "After father died, we had to manage everything ourselves. Grandmother taught me what she knew, and I figured out the rest." "You've done a fine job," he said, meaning more than just the horses. Grace glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. "You sound surprised." "I am," he admitted. "Not many women could maintain a homestead like this. Not many are given the chance to try." She straightened, brushing hay from her skirt. "Most men assume we're too delicate for real work. I don't think anyone could mistake you for delicate, Miss Reeves." To his surprise, she laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment, though I'm not sure you meant it as one." "I did," Vincent said, suddenly earnest. "Delicate things break out here. You've clearly been forged stronger." Something shifted in her eyes, a wariness giving way to cautious regard. "And you, Vincent Jameson, what has the frontier forged you into?" The question struck closer to his core than he was comfortable with. "Someone who survives," he finally said. "Is that enough?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, a particularly violent gust shook the barn and a section of the roof groaned ominously. Vincent reacted instinctively, pulling Grace away just as a portion of the ceiling collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. They stood frozen in the aftermath, his arms still around her, hearts racing from the near miss. Grace looked up at him, snow and hay dusting her hair, her face inches from his. For one disorienting moment, Vincent forgot all the reasons he kept people at a distance. Grace broke the spell, stepping back with a shaky breath. "We should secure the rest of the roof before more gives way." They worked in silence after that, finding boards and tools to reinforce the damaged section. By the time they finished, both were exhausted and chilled to the bone. Back in the cabin, Eliza took one look at their snow-covered forms and set about preparing hot tea. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death," she instructed, pointing to blankets warming by the fire. As Vincent changed into dry clothes behind a privacy screen Eliza had arranged, he tried to make sense of his reaction in the barn. He'd felt protective before of his ranch hands, his livestock, even strangers in danger, but this had been different, more immediate and personal. It unsettled him. Later, as the women prepared for bed, Vincent insisted on taking the floor near the fire rather than displacing either of them from their beds. Wrapped in borrowed blankets that smelled of lavender and wood smoke, he listened to the storm's fury and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. "Vincent," Grace's voice came softly from the darkness of her curtained sleeping area. "Yes," he answered, equally quiet to avoid waking Eliza. "Thank you, for today, for helping with the roof, all of it." "Anyone would have done the same," he demurred. There was a pause then. "No, they wouldn't have." "Good night, Vincent." "Good night, Grace," he replied, staring into the dying embers and wondering why her simple words of gratitude had affected him more deeply than any praise he'd received in years. As sleep finally claimed him, Vincent's last conscious thought was that he'd broken his own cardinal rule. He'd allowed himself to care about what happened to Grace Reeves and her grandmother. In the frontier's harsh calculus, caring was the first step toward loss, a lesson his father had demonstrated all too well. Yet as the storm raged outside and the cabin stood warm and secure around him, Vincent couldn't bring himself to regret the connection he'd made today. Not yet. Morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Vincent woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. Grace and Eliza moved about the cabin with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to sharing space, preparing breakfast and tending to morning chores. "Our guest awakens," Eliza noted as Vincent sat up, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair, "just in time for hot cakes." "You didn't need to go to such trouble," he said, folding the borrowed blankets. Grace set a steaming cup of coffee before him. "Grandmother never needs an excuse to make hot cakes, it's her specialty." "And you'll need a hearty breakfast before you dig us out," Eliza added practically. The snows drifted something terrible against the doors. After breakfast, Vincent and Grace spent hours clearing paths to the barn, well, and outhouse. The labor was demanding, but Vincent found himself enjoying the shared work, the way they established a rhythm without needing many words. Grace was stronger than she looked, tackling the heavy snow without complaint. "Your grandmother mentioned you teach reading," Vincent said during a brief rest. Grace leaned on her shovel. "I do. Mostly to children whose parents can't send them into town for school or who need extra help. Sometimes to adults who never had the chance to learn." "That's admirable work." She shrugged, but he caught the hint of pride in her eyes. "It was my father's passion. He believed education was the key to a better future, even out here, especially out here." "Is that what you believe too?" Grace considered the question. "I believe knowledge gives people choices. Without it, we're all just surviving, not living." She gave him a searching look. "What about you? What does Vincent Jameson believe in?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people in these parts kept conversation light, sticking to weather and cattle prices. Personal beliefs were private matters. "I believe in hard work and self-reliance," he finally said. "Nothing else," she pressed. Vincent frowned. "Isn't that enough?" "For surviving, perhaps." Grace echoed his earlier words, but with a challenge in her tone. "But is it enough for living?" Before he could formulate a response, a sound caught their attention, the approach of horses and a wagon. Grace straightened, her expression turning guarded as she recognized the newcomers. "The Hartley brothers," she murmured, just loud enough for Vincent to hear. "They've been trying to buy our land for months, never with friendly intentions." Three men pulled their horses to a stop at the edge of the cleared area. The oldest, a burly man with a thick beard, called out with false joviality, "Miss Reeves, checking to make sure you ladies weathered the storm." "As you can see, we're fine, Mr. Hartley," Grace replied coolly. "Though I doubt concern for our welfare brought you all this way through the snow." The man's friendly facade slipped slightly, just being neighborly. "Besides, with winter coming on, I thought you might have reconsidered my offer for this place." "Can't be easy for two women alone." "As you can see, we're not alone today," Grace nodded toward Vincent, "and our answer remains the same." Hartley's gaze shifted to Vincent, his expression hardening with recognition. "Jameson. Didn't expect to find you out here." "Hartley," Vincent acknowledged with a neutral nod. He knew Silas Hartley by reputation, a cattle rancher with ambitions that often seemed to expand at his neighbor's expense. "Interesting company you're keeping," Hartley remarked, his implication clear in his tone. "Your father would have been more particular about associating with certain elements." Vincent felt a flare of anger at both the insult to Grace and the invoking of his father. "My father valued honesty and fair dealing above all," he said evenly. "As do I." Hartley's eyes narrowed. "Just a friendly warning, Jameson. Some entanglements bring more trouble than they're worth." His gaze flicked to Grace. "My offer stands, Miss Reeves, but it won't stand forever. Land's only valuable to me with enough time to prepare it for spring grazing." With that veiled threat, Hartley and his brothers turned their horses and departed, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. "What did he mean about your father?" Grace finally asked. Vincent hesitated. "Nothing worth repeating. I've heard worse, I assure you." "That doesn't make it right." Vincent found himself genuinely angered by Hartley's casual prejudice. "Have they threatened you before?" Grace resumed shoveling, not directly. "Just increasingly urgent offers to buy land that's been in my grandmother's family for 30 years. She paused. "They've scared off others who might have helped us with repairs or heavy work. That's why the barn roof was in such poor condition." Vincent studied the retreating figures of the Hartley brothers, a decision forming in his mind before he fully recognized it. "I could stay another day." "Help with those repairs." Grace stopped mid-motion, looking at him with surprise. "You'd do that, even after Hartley's warning?" "Especially after that," Vincent replied, surprised by his own vehemence. "I make my own judgments about who deserves help." Something like respect kindled in Grace's eyes. "One day won't be enough to fix everything." "Then I'll come back," Vincent heard himself say, as if someone else were making promises with his voice. "I can spare time each week until the major repairs are done." "Why would you do that for strangers?" It was a fair question, one Vincent wasn't sure he could answer. Why was he offering to help this woman and her grandmother when he'd spent years deliberately avoiding entanglements? when he knew better than most how dangerous it was to care too deeply in a land that took more than it gave. "Maybe I'm tired of just surviving," he said finally, the admission surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Grace studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. Then she nodded once, decisively. "All right then. We accept your help, Vincent Jameson, but on one condition." "Which is?" A small smile curved her lips. "That you let us help you too." Vincent frowned in confusion. "I don't need." "Everyone needs something," she interrupted. "Even self-reliant cowboys who think caring is a weakness." Her perception was uncomfortably accurate. "And what do you think I need?" Grace's smile widened, transforming her face. "I guess we'll find out together." That evening, as they sat around the table planning repairs, Vincent realized he had made a decision that directly contradicted years of careful isolation. He told himself it was merely the right thing to do, helping a widow and her granddaughter stand against bullies like the Hartleys. It had nothing to do with the way Grace's eyes lit up when she spoke passionately about her students, or how her quiet strength reminded him of possibilities he'd long abandoned. Nothing at all. True to his word, Vincent returned to the Reeves homestead the following weekend. He arrived early Saturday morning with tools and materials loaded in his wagon, prepared for a day of hard work. What he wasn't prepared for was the warmth of the welcome he received, or the unfamiliar sense of purpose that filled him as Grace outlined the most urgent repairs. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Vincent would arrive at dawn on Saturday, work alongside Grace until dusk, then return on Sunday to continue their efforts. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence, other times engaged in conversations that ranged from practical matters to surprisingly philosophical debates. Grace, he discovered, had opinions on everything from politics to literature, and didn't hesitate to challenge his views when they differed from hers. Where Vincent saw the frontier as a place that demanded emotional armor, Grace saw it as a canvas for creating something meaningful despite the hardships. "The difficulty is precisely the point," she argued one afternoon as they repaired fence posts. "Anything worth having requires struggle, otherwise what value would it have?" "Some things aren't worth the pain they bring," Vincent countered, thinking of his father's hollow existence after his mother's death. Grace studied him. "You're thinking of your father, aren't you? How he couldn't bear to live without your mother." Vincent nodded reluctantly. He existed for years afterward, but he wasn't living. "That kind of dependence on another person, it's dangerous." "Maybe," Grace conceded, surprising him, "but isn't there a difference between loving someone and making them your entire reason for existence?" "Between connection and dependence." The question lingered with Vincent long after he'd returned to his own ranch that evening. He found himself examining his father's grief from a new perspective. Had it been love that destroyed Charles Jameson, or had it been his inability to find meaning beyond his wife? As November deepened toward December, the major repairs to the Reeves homestead were completed. The barn stood secure against winter storms, the cabin roof no longer leaked, and the well had been reinforced. By any objective measure, Vincent had fulfilled his promise of assistance. Yet each Saturday still found him making the journey to the small valley, often bringing small luxuries from town: coffee, sugar, a new book for Eliza. He told himself it was concern for their welfare, with the Hartleys still circling like vultures. But in honest moments, usually late at night when sleep eluded him, Vincent admitted there was more to it. He had come to care for them both, Eliza with her sharp wit and wisdom, and Grace with her fierce independence and unexpected gentleness. More than that, he had come to care about who he was when he was with them. In their company, the armor he'd worn for years seemed less necessary, even cumbersome. The town began to notice. Vincent caught the speculative glances when he purchased items clearly not meant for a bachelor's ranch. He heard the whispers when he defended the Reeves women against slander in the saloon. Most concerning were the dark looks from Silas Hartley and his brothers, who seemed to take Vincent's involvement as a personal affront. "You're making enemies," Sheriff Dawson warned him one December afternoon. "Hartley's been asking questions about your property line disputes from 2 years back." "Let him," Vincent replied. "Those disputes were settled legally." "Just be careful, son. Hartley plays rough when he doesn't get his way." Vincent nodded his thanks for the warning, but inwardly dismissed the concern. He had always kept to himself, avoiding the feuds and alliances that characterized frontier politics. Surely his helping the Reeves women with some repairs couldn't provoke serious retaliation. The following Saturday, Vincent arrived at the Reeves homestead to find Grace alone. Eliza had gone to assist with a difficult birth at a neighboring farm, Grace explained as they walked toward the barn. She's known for her midwifery skills, she added. Before the town had a proper doctor, grandmother delivered half the babies in the county. She's a remarkable woman, Vincent agreed. As is her granddaughter. The compliment brought a flush to Grace's cheeks, but she didn't shy away from his gaze. Careful, Vincent, that almost sounds like sentiment. Her teasing tone made him smile. Heaven forbid. They spent the morning splitting and stacking firewood, working in comfortable rhythm. When they broke for lunch, Grace suggested they eat by the small creek that gave the homestead its water supply, now partially frozen but still beautiful with ice formations catching the winter sunlight. Seated on a fallen log, sharing bread, cheese, and hot coffee from a thermos, Vincent found himself more at ease than he could remember being in years. Grace sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through his coat sleeve, her honey-blonde hair escaping its braid in tendrils that caught the sunlight. Why does Hartley want your land so badly? Vincent asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Grace sighed. The water, this creek remains flowing even in the driest summers. If he controlled it, he could essentially control who succeeds and who fails in this valley. And your grandmother won't sell. This land is her history, her life with Samuel, her daughter's childhood, her memories. She'd sooner die than sell it to someone who doesn't respect what it means. Grace looked at him directly. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. The conviction in her voice moved something in Vincent, admiration, certainly, but also a recognition of how his own life had shrunk in comparison. What was he fighting for? What would he defend with such passion? You make me question things I thought I was certain about, he admitted. Grace's expression softened. Is that a complaint? I haven't decided yet. Vincent found himself leaning slightly closer to her, drawn by an impulse he'd been fighting for weeks. A moment of tension stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibility. Then Grace's hand found his, her fingers cold against his palm. I'm glad you came into Willard's store that day, she said quietly. Even if you do still think caring is dangerous. I'm starting to think some dangers might be worth facing, Vincent replied, his voice low. The moment hung suspended between them, fragile as frost. Then a sound, horses approaching, broke the spell. Grace withdrew her hand quickly, standing as three riders came into view. Vincent recognized the Hartley brothers immediately, tension coiling through him as he saw the determination in their postures. This was not a casual visit. Well, isn't this cozy? Silas Hartley called, his voice carrying across the clearing. The rebel and the rancher having a picnic. Vincent stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Grace. What brings you here, Hartley? Official business, Hartley patted his vest pocket. Got papers here saying this property's taxes are in arrears. County's authorized me to claim it in exchange for settling the debt. That's impossible, Grace stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pallor that had spread across her face. Grandmother paid the taxes in full last month. I was with her at the county office. Hartley shrugged with exaggerated regret. Records say different, miss. Maybe there was some confusion about which property the payment applied to. Easy mistake. There's no mistake, Vincent said firmly. Only fraud. Sheriff Dawson will be interested to hear about this. Sheriff's out of town until Tuesday, Hartley's younger brother piped up. Hunting trip up north. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Vincent's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but Hartley's brothers had already drawn their weapons. No need for trouble, Jameson, Hartley said smoothly. This is legal business between me and the Reeves women. You're just a bystander. A bystander who's witnessed your attempted theft, Vincent countered. Hartley's expression hardened. I've been patient with you, Jameson, out of respect for your father, but my patience has limits. He turned to Grace. You have until sundown to clear out. Take personal effects only, the property and all improvements stay. We will do no such thing, Grace replied, her voice cold with fury. This land belongs to my grandmother, legally and morally. Your fraudulent papers won't change that. For an instant, genuine rage contorted Hartley's features before he controlled it. Your choice, then. But when we return at sundown, we won't be asking nicely. He looked at Vincent. And you'd be wise to be elsewhere, unless you want to find yourself facing accusations about that property line dispute from last year. With that threat hanging in the air, the Hartleys wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving Vincent and Grace standing in the suddenly silent clearing. "They'll be back," Vincent said grimly, "with more men." Grace's face was pale but determined. "Then we'll be ready. I need to get word to grandmother, warn her not to return until this is resolved. I'll ride to the Henderson place, let them know what's happening. Then to my ranch for reinforcements." Vincent gripped her shoulders gently. "Grace, this could turn dangerous. Maybe you should." "If you're about to suggest I abandon our home, save your breath," she interrupted. "I won't give Hartley the satisfaction." Vincent recognized the steel in her tone, the same determination that had first caught his attention in Willard's store. "All right, but we do this smart. No heroics." As they hurried back to the cabin to prepare, Vincent felt a curious mix of dread and clarity. For years he'd avoided commitment, entanglement, caring too deeply, all to prevent the kind of pain his father had suffered. Yet here he was, willingly placing himself between danger and a woman he'd known barely 2 months. More surprising still was the realization that he felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. The frontier had always been a place of danger, but in trying to insulate himself from its harshest realities, he'd also cut himself off from its possibilities, from connection, from meaning beyond mere survival. Vincent reached the Henderson homestead in record time, quickly explaining the situation to James Henderson, a grizzled farmer who had no love for the Hartleys. Henderson promised to spread word to other neighbors who might help, then offered to find Eliza and keep her safely away until the confrontation was resolved. At his own ranch, Vincent gathered his most trusted hands, men who had worked alongside him for years and understood both his usual reticence and the significance of his current request for aid. 4 agreed to ride with him immediately, bringing extra weapons and ammunition. By the time they returned to the Reeves homestead, Grace had transformed the cabin into a defensible position. Furniture barricaded vulnerable windows, and she had positioned the family's rifles at strategic points. "Grandmother taught me to shoot when I was 12, she explained when Vincent raised an eyebrow at her competence with weapons. "She said a woman alone needed to protect herself, especially one with mixed blood." As they prepared for the coming confrontation, Vincent found moments to observe Grace, her efficiency, her courage, her absolute refusal to be intimidated. He realized with sudden clarity that he'd been wrong all these years. The frontier's harshness didn't demand emotional isolation as protection. It required precisely the opposite. The strength that came from connection, from having something, someone worth fighting for. "Grace," he said quietly during a lull in preparations, "whatever happens tonight, I want you to know." She turned to him, her expression softening despite the tension of the moment. "I know, Vincent." "You do?" he asked, surprised. A small smile touched her lips. "You're not as unreadable as you think." Before he could respond, one of his ranch hands called from his lookout position, "Riders coming." "At least 8 men." The moment for personal revelations had passed. Vincent squeezed Grace's hand briefly before moving to his position by the front window. "Stay low and out of sight as much as possible," he instructed. "Let me try to talk first." Dusk had fallen, casting long shadows across the yard as Hartley and his men approached. They came with confidence, clearly not expecting armed resistance. Vincent counted 9 riders, including all 3 Hartley brothers. "That's far enough," Vincent called when they were still 30 yards from the cabin. "This property belongs to the Reeves family, and you're trespassing." Silas Hartley reined his horse to a stop, genuine surprise crossing his features as he registered Vincent and the armed men positioned around the cabin. "Jameson, I warned you to stay out of this." "And I chose not to take your advice," Vincent replied evenly. "There's still a peaceful way to resolve this. Ride away, destroy those fraudulent papers, and we'll forget this attempted theft." Hartley's face darkened with anger. "You're backing the wrong side, Jameson. These women don't belong here, never have. The land should go to someone who can use it properly." "The land belongs to whoever rightfully owns it," Vincent countered. "And that's Eliza Reeves." For a moment tension hung in the air like gunsmoke, then Hartley made a subtle gesture and his men began spreading out, taking offensive positions. "Last chance, Jameson," Hartley called. "Walk away now or you'll regret it." Vincent's answer came in the form of the rifle he raised to his shoulder, aimed squarely at Hartley. Around him, his men and Grace did the same, presenting a united front against the would-be land thieves. What followed was a standoff that stretched nerves to breaking point. For nearly 10 minutes, neither side spoke or moved, each waiting for the other to make the first mistake. Vincent could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite the December chill, his finger steady on the trigger. It was one of Hartley's younger men who broke first, firing wildly toward the cabin. The shot went wide, but it was the spark that ignited the confrontation. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the crack of rifles splitting the twilight quiet. Vincent focused on protecting Grace, calling directions to his men between shots. They had the advantage of cover, but Hartley's men outnumbered them. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Vincent's head, another thudded into the wall behind him. Through the chaos, he was acutely aware of Grace beside him, reloading and firing with grim determination. No fear showed in her face, only concentration and a fierce resolve to defend what was hers. The firefight seemed to last hours, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Then, remarkably, new voices joined the fray, shouts from behind Hartley's position. Vincent risked a glance and saw James Henderson leading a group of neighbors, their approach splitting Hartley's attention. Caught between defenders, Hartley's men began to falter. 2 fell wounded, a third retreated in panic. When Henderson's group opened fire from behind, the remainder scattered, leaving only the Hartley brothers exposed in the yard. "It's over, Silas," Vincent called. "Drop your weapons." For a moment, it seemed Hartley might choose death over surrender. His face contorted with rage as he raised his rifle once more, aimed directly at the window where Grace stood. Vincent reacted without conscious thought, throwing himself in front of her as Hartley's rifle cracked. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, spinning him backward into Grace's arms. He heard her cry out, felt her lowering him to the floor as gunfire continued outside. "Vincent. Vincent, stay with me." Grace's voice seemed to come from very far away, her face swimming above him as darkness encroached at the edges of his vision. He tried to reach for her, to tell her he was all right, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away was Grace's voice, fierce and determined. "Don't you dare leave me now, Vincent Jameson, not when I've just found you." Vincent drifted in and out of consciousness, aware at times of movement, voices, pain that flared and receded like tide. He caught fragments of conversation, Grace's tense questions, Eliza's calm instructions, the murmur of men he recognized as his ranch hands and neighbors. When he finally woke properly, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains, and the pain in his shoulder had dulled to a persistent throb. He was in a bed, Grace's bed, he realized, recognizing the small shelf of books beside it. "Welcome back," came Eliza's voice from beside him. The elderly woman sat in a rocking chair, her hands busy with knitting needles that clicked rhythmically. "You gave us quite a scare." Vincent tried to speak, found his throat painfully dry. Eliza set aside her knitting and helped him sip water from a cup. "What happened?" he managed finally. "Hartley." "Dead," Eliza said simply. "His brothers are in custody." Sheriff Dawson returned early when word reached him about the confrontation. Vincent closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information. "Grace." A soft smile crossed Eliza's weathered face. "Physically fine." Emotionally, she shook her head. "She's barely left your side for 3 days. I finally ordered her to get some rest a few hours ago." 3 days, Vincent tried to sit up, gasping as pain lanced through his shoulder. "Be still," Eliza chided. "The bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood. You need time to heal." Before Vincent could respond, the door opened and Grace appeared, her face lighting with relief when she saw him awake. "You're back," she breathed, crossing quickly to the bedside. Eliza rose with a knowing smile. "I'll make some broth, he needs to eat." When they were alone, Grace sat carefully on the edge of the bed, her eyes searching his face. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule," Vincent admitted, managing a weak smile, "but alive." "You almost weren't," her voice caught. "When you fell, when I saw the blood." Vincent reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. "I'm sorry for frightening you." "No, I'm sorry. This was my fight, not yours. You shouldn't have." "It became my fight the moment I cared about what happened to you," Vincent interrupted. "And that happened the first day in Willard's store." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Even then?" "Even then," he confirmed, Though I fought against it, caring about people, it makes you vulnerable. I learned that from my father. It also makes you strong, Grace countered softly. Stronger than you could ever be alone. Vincent thought about the clarity he'd felt during the confrontation, the absolute certainty that protecting Grace was worth any risk. I'm beginning to understand that. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. When you jumped in front of that bullet. I didn't think, Vincent admitted. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to you. Grace leaned forward, her free hand gently touching his face. That's what love is, Vincent, not thinking. Just knowing in your bones that someone else's life matters more than your own safety. Love, Vincent repeated the word as if testing its weight, its meaning. For years he'd avoided it, feared it, equated it with weakness and inevitable pain. Yet in this moment, with Grace beside him and the memory of what he'd been willing to risk for her, the word felt right, true. Yes, love, Grace said firmly, and you can run from it if you want once you're healed. Go back to your ranch and your careful isolation. But know this, she leaned closer, her eyes intense on his. I love you, Vincent Jameson, and I'm not afraid to say it. I love your kindness that you try to hide, your integrity, your willingness to stand for what's right even when it costs you. And if loving means risking heartbreak, then I'll take that risk gladly. Her declaration left him speechless. Not because it was unexpected, he had seen her feelings growing alongside his own over these past months, but because her courage in voicing them threw his own fear into sharp relief. I don't want to go back, he said finally, not to isolation, not to just surviving. He tightened his grip on her hand. I love you, Grace. I think I have since the moment you stood up to Willard and wouldn't back down. The smile that illuminated her face was worth every moment of pain, every risk he'd taken. She leaned down and kissed him gently, mindful of his injury, her lips soft and warm against his. When she pulled back, they were both smiling. Grandmother will be unbearably smug, Grace murmured. She's been predicting this since your first visit. Vincent chuckled despite the pain it caused. Wise woman, I should have listened to her sooner. The weeks of Vincent's recovery transformed the Reeves homestead. Word of the confrontation with the Hartleys spread throughout the county, casting both Vincent and the Reeves women in a heroic light. Neighbors who had kept their distance, intimidated by the Hartleys or uncomfortable with Eliza's mixed marriage, now came calling with food and offers of assistance. More significantly, the events forced Silver Creek to confront its treatment of the Reeves family. When Sheriff Dawson investigated the fraudulent tax papers, he uncovered a pattern of discrimination that implicated several prominent townspeople, including Mr. Willard. The resulting scandal led to public apologies and a newfound respect for Eliza's long history in the territory. For Vincent, the weeks of healing brought a different kind of transformation. Confined to the Reeves cabin, unable to maintain his usual independence, he was forced to accept help from Grace, from Eliza, from his ranch hands who came regularly to report on his property and livestock. The experience was humbling but also freeing, showing him that dependence wasn't always weakness. He and Grace spent long hours in conversation, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. She read to him from her favorite books, challenging his views and making him laugh with her sharp observations. In turn, he taught her about cattle ranching, impressed by her quick mind and practical questions. By the time spring arrived, bringing the first green shoots to the valley, Vincent's shoulder had healed enough for him to resume most activities. The decision facing him, whether to return full-time to his ranch or forge a new path, was complicated by his deepening relationship with Grace and his growing attachment to the Reeves homestead. It was Eliza who finally forced the issue, calling them both to the table one evening after dinner. I've been patient, she announced without preamble, but at my age, patience has limits. Grandmother, Grace began, but Eliza raised a hand to silence her. Vincent Jameson, do you intend to marry my granddaughter or simply court her indefinitely? The elderly woman demanded. Vincent, caught mid-sip of coffee, nearly choked. Grace's face flamed crimson. Grandmother, please. It's a reasonable question, Eliza insisted. The man's been making cow eyes at you for months, recovered from a bullet wound in your bed, and still hasn't made his intentions clear. A woman has a right to know. Despite his embarrassment, Vincent found himself smiling at Eliza's directness. She reminded him so much of his own mother, practical, loving, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind. You're right, Mrs. Reeves, he said, setting down his cup and turning to face Grace. I've been remiss. Grace's eyes widened. Vincent, you don't have to. But I want to. He took her hand across the table. I've been trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words, but maybe there aren't any. Maybe it's enough to simply say that I love you and I want to build a life with you. The blush on Grace's cheeks deepened, but her eyes shone. Are you asking me to marry you? I am, Vincent confirmed, suddenly certain. Not because your grandmother is pressuring me, though her timing is impeccable, but because these months have shown me what life can be when it's shared with someone you love. He glanced at Eliza, with your blessing, of course. Eliza snorted. As if my blessing would stop either of you if your minds were set, but yes, you have it, for whatever it's worth. Grace's answer came in the form of a kiss that left no doubt about her feelings, much to Eliza's amused approval. Later, as they walked beneath stars that seemed to shimmer with possibility, they discussed practical matters, whether to live at Vincent's ranch or the Reeves homestead, how to combine their separate lives into one shared future. We could join the properties, Vincent suggested as they paused by the creek where they'd nearly kissed months ago. My ranch borders your land to the north. Together, they'd make a formidable operation. Grace considered this, her practical mind already envisioning possibilities. It would give us control of the water rights for the entire valley. No one could threaten either property again. And your teaching, I wouldn't want you to give that up. Her smile warmed him even in the cool spring night. I won't have to. The combined property would put us closer to several families with children who can't reach the town school. I could expand my lessons. As they made plans beneath the vast Montana sky, Vincent marveled at the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been a man determined to avoid connection at all costs, convinced that the frontier allowed no space for love or vulnerability. Now he stood with his arms around a woman who had shown him a different truth. That true strength came not from isolation but from the courage to care deeply, to risk everything for someone else's well-being. The wedding took place in June, when wildflowers carpeted the valley and the promise of summer hung in the air. It was a larger affair than either Vincent or Grace had initially wanted, but the entire community insisted on celebrating what many now called the romance that tamed the Hartleys. Eliza, resplendent in a dress she'd saved from her own wedding, gave the bride away. Sheriff Dawson stood as Vincent's best man, a friendship that had developed during the investigation into the Hartleys' fraud. Even Mr. Willard attended, somewhat chastened by recent events and conspicuously charging fair prices to all customers these days. As Vincent watched Grace walk toward him, radiant in a gown of ivory silk with wildflowers woven into her honey-blonde hair, he reflected on the false belief that had nearly cost him this happiness. That caring was dangerous, that love was weakness, that the frontier demanded emotional isolation. The truth, he now understood, was exactly the opposite. The harsh realities of frontier life didn't diminish the need for love, they magnified it. Connection wasn't a luxury to be sacrificed for survival, it was the very thing that made survival meaningful. When Grace reached him and took his hands, her hazel eyes shining with a love that still humbled him daily, Vincent felt the last piece of his father's bitter lesson fall away. Charles Jameson hadn't been destroyed by loving too deeply. He'd been destroyed by forgetting that love was meant to be a beginning, not an end, a foundation for building something lasting, not a monument to what had been lost. Ready? Grace whispered, squeezing his hands. Vincent nodded, his heart full, for everything. That evening, as celebration continued around them, the newlyweds slipped away to the creek that had witnessed so many moments of their courtship. The setting sun painted the valley in gold and amber, promising many such sunsets to come. Happy? Grace asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. Beyond words, Vincent replied honestly. You've given me back something I thought was lost forever, the courage to care, to build, to believe in possibilities. Grace turned in his arms, her expression serious despite her joy. That courage was always in you, Vincent. You just needed a reason to remember it. As he kissed his bride beneath the Montana sky, Vincent silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to Willard's store that autumn day, placing him in the path of a defiant young woman who refused to accept injustice. She had taught him that the frontier's greatest lesson wasn't how to survive alone, but how to create something worth surviving for. Together, they would build a life that honored that lesson, a home where love wasn't feared but celebrated, where vulnerability was recognized as strength, and where the harsh realities of the frontier were met not with isolation, but with the unwavering support of hearts joined in common purpose. For Vincent Jameson, caring cowboy no longer afraid of falling head over heels, the unlikely town rebel had become his truest home.